CARES Northwest, presenting on dynamics of child sexual abuse. And I'm going to read their bios and then we're going to get started. So Denise Elijah is a facilitator and educator who began her journey with youth in 1999. She joined CARES Northwest in 2017. She spent 10 years creating and facilitating socio-emotional curriculum with high school and middle school students with Open School, formerly known as Open Meadows, as well as Girls Inc. Her experience has included personal advocacy work and mentoring with youth, from middle school students to teen parents. She is passionate about racial equity and intersectionality and has also led many trainings around these subjects. As a member of the CARES Northwest prevention team, Denise looks to engage others in wrestling with their own ideas, beliefs, and reactions to the culture of sexual violence and abuse. And Sally Blackwood is a licensed professional counselor who began working with children who've experienced trauma in 1990. She has worked at CARES Northwest since 2006 and previously worked in residential treatment, community mental health, and private practice. Her experience includes working for almost 10 years as a counselor on the Family Sex Abuse Treatment Team of Multnomah County, Oregon. She has experience in training and counseling children, teens, families, and adults who've experienced trauma with a specialty in sexual abuse. Currently, Sally is a member of the CARES Northwest prevention team and presents to youth and adults. Sally has also presented to regional conferences and nationally on violence prevention, as well as child sexual abuse and trauma. So big welcome to you both. Thank you so much. And I'm going to turn this over to you all.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. I think it's so interesting to hear those read because we usually introduce ourselves so differently. So I'm Sally Blackwood. I use she, her pronouns. And I'm really super excited to be here today because Danish and I are very passionate about de-siloing prevention efforts and connecting with the domestic violence, sexual violence world and advocates. So that's one of our passions. Native Oregonian and happy to be here and happy to be reaching out to all of Oregon and maybe even beyond today. So thanks for having us.
And like said in the bio, I'm Denise Elijah. Yes, I started in 1999, but that was right out of high school. So I'm not as old as my bio makes me sound. I'm so excited to be here with everyone. We definitely enjoy spending time with folks that are associated with the DVSV world. And we recognize that there's just so much to be done in prevention and that it can best be done when we all work together with a deeper understanding of some of the dynamics of each other's work. So very happy to be here.
We're going to have a slideshow. We're going to have some times for sharing in the chat. I think we'll have a breakout room. We'll have a poll that you can take or a quiz. So it's going to be a little bit dynamic and interactive. And please take care of yourself in any way you need to. And we'll bring that up a little bit more. I'm going to be sharing, for the most part, I'm sharing the slides. So I may say some things to Denise. Because it's easier for her to read the chat sometimes when I'm sharing the slide and stuff like that. Anything else for introduction, Denise?
Yes, so yeah, just so everyone knows, Sally cannot see me when she's sharing the slides, which makes it a little challenging, but we appreciate everyone's patience and we're really excited to start sharing this information with everyone.
With that, we'll get rolling. Let me look here for a second. There we go. I'm going to do one more technical thing and then we'll start here. All right. That black box will go away in a second. So we are from CARES Northwest, which is a child advocacy in Portland. And some of you may know some about us. We'll talk a little bit more about who we are later, but just by way of introduction, we are the prevention team, and we have a large prevention program, actually. Part of that is middle school prevention curriculum, comprehensive prevention curriculum that goes over bullying, sexual violence of different types, and healthy teen dating relationships and things like that. And it's the adopted curriculum for Portland Public Schools, Hillsborough School District, Beaverton School District, and Tiger Tualatin. And people are doing it in Yamhill County as well. Denise, do you want to say anything else about CARES?
No, that's everything. Oh, I don't know if we said that it covers from 18 and under, that folks 18 and under can be referred to CARES Northwest.
Yeah. So most people know us as the medical office that kids go to, kids meaning 18 or under, when there's concerns that they've been hurt or victimized. We also have our prevention team, and that's what we're representing. We are a nonprofit that is composed of these 4 different health systems. And we have an office in Beaverton as well as Portland. So today, here's what we're going to talk about. We're going to throw out some definitions of child sex abuse, have a little bit of discussion and or thought-provoking ideas around that, I think. Understand the unique dynamics of child sex abuse, particularly on a developmental level. Thinking about what is that developmental trajectory for humans as they're experiencing sexual violence, and particularly in relationship to power differences and emotional boundary manipulation, or what is often called gaslighting, and brain development. And what does that mean for how children make sense of abuse, and particularly child sexual abuse? Understand a little bit more about how it happens, who does it, why they do it, and then talk a bit about how we message mandatory reporting and give you a couple of resources around that. That's what we're hoping to cover today. Jumping right in here. This is a definition that comes from the mental health world, from the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, which is a great website that compiles a bunch of different information around child traumatic stress of all different kinds, including community violence, domestic violence, dating violence, and things like war. And it always updates things, and they often have things in Spanish. So having said that, I'm going to read this definition, and I'm going to slow down for the interpreter. Child sexual abuse is any interaction between a child and an adult or another child in which the child is used for the sexual stimulation of the perpetrator or an observer. May involve physical contact, such as touching or kissing. May involve child or teen being exposed to the offender's body or sexual behavior. Okay, so just that first sentence, the way we're going to focus on that today is we're going to go into discussions and present some ideas around the differences between like child sexual abuse, sexual assault, particularly teen sexual assault, and looking at that. What are those nuances? What are those differences? What are some commonalities around that? I'm going to do a little bit of talking about problematic sexual behavior as well, just to clarify that difference. So you might have heard people talking about that. And then the second part of the definition says something we all know, right? Not all sexual violence involves contact or touch, right? There's one other definition we're going to go over, which comes from the American Academy of Pediatrics. Child sexual abuse involves a child or teen being engaged in sexual activities that they do not understand or comprehend, which they are not developmentally prepared for and cannot give consent, and or violates law or social taboo. I'm going to unpack this a little bit and tell you how we're hoping to illuminate this definition through what we're talking about today. So I'm guessing most of us here would think little kids, earlier elementary age kids, preschool kids, younger than that, certainly cannot comprehend or understand sexual behavior that is directed towards them or that people engage them in an abusive way, right? What about kids who are growing and learning? How do they comprehend sexuality and particularly power dynamics around sexuality as they age, as they get older? And one metaphor Denise and I really like is thinking about driving a car. Okay. Think about asking a 5-year-old, what do you know about driving a car? They'd say, well, yeah, I've been in a car and it drive down the street and it takes us from place to place. They might not even say there's a gas pedal, there's a brake pedal. You know, I know that you make it move by this. They might, by the steering wheel. They might say a little bit about that. A 10-year-old probably would say some about that. They'd probably be able to say the driver sits in this seat. You know, they make the car go by putting the gas pedal down and the brakes and turning the wheel, right? But they wouldn't understand all the rules of the road. They wouldn't understand kind of actually how to do it if they got behind a wheel. They wouldn't be a good driver. So then think about teenagers. Yes, they're learning. They can get a driver's permit at 15, start driving, and can learn how to operate that car really well. They're understanding what that car is, how it works, how to make it do what they want it to do, right? And yet, as a society, we also think about their brain's not all the way developed. So, you know, we have rules and laws and regulations around that. You know, you can't rent a car until you're 21. You can't, you know, insurance will charge you more until you're 25 years old, and then they drop the price. And there's also these rules in Oregon around drivers who are under 18 that are different. And all that is because of that understanding of development and brain development. So thinking about that metaphor, I hope you hold it in your mind as we are talking about sexual violence and child sex abuse today. The second sentence there says sexual exploitation is using a child or a teen in sexual activity for personal gain, such as trafficking or pornography production. Okay, that's similar to what the other one said, but putting some more details there. Again, other kinds of sexual violence that children are engaged in that have to do with basically somebody else making some money or gaining off of it.
So thinking about how many folks have experienced child sexual abuse, this information is from the CDC website, from the original, some of it's from the original A study, some of it's from the 2015 information that came out from the state of Oregon. But of course, we also know that many of these are underreporting. But just to share what some of those statistics say, that 1 in 4 women report that when they were a child, that they were abused, and 1 in 6 men report being abused as a child. And so we can see that those numbers, and in Oregon, I'm sorry, I wasn't supposed to do that. I'm trying to keep my flow for the interpreter, I'm sorry. In Oregon, that those latest statistics were 1 in 5 women and 1 in 12 men. And so when we see those statistics, we see that it's very common. And this is, of course, compounded when we're looking at child sexual abuse and statistics around sexual and violence in general. We can see how many people are impacted by that. And we see that 34% are younger than 9. So that also means that there's a higher degree, older than 9, right? Higher amount of people. And that 90% of child sexual abuse is perpetrated by someone the child knows and trusts. And of course, that statistic is probably very familiar, probably feels very similar to some of the statistics around other kinds of sexual violence. But when it's done by a family member, we have that 50% of the time, that's with kids under 6, but only 12% of the time when we think about kids that are 12 to 17. And so when we think back to that, definition of child sexual abuse and thinking about what kids know and understand about the things that are happening to them, that really puts me in mind of that larger portion of kids between 12 and 17 that are being harmed by someone outside of the family, and just trying to understand what's the dynamic there. We're going to look at the kids under that age as well, but just thinking about that age dynamic, just because we all know there's some tricky things happening. There's a lot of work the brain's trying to do with development, and putting that information together with what we can see as the reality of child sexual abuse with adolescents in particular.
Like I said, I was going to say a little bit about child sexual behavior and what you might have heard of related to that, the term problematic sexual behavior. And so, just like any other development, we all as human beings have stages of development that we go through. And most adults understand that about kids. They know approximately what age a kid would usually like roll over for the first time, or crawl, or walk, those kinds of things. And we also understand that as we are developing humans, we are learning about ourselves, about our bodies, about the world. And so the first studies of sexual development, child sexual development, were done in like the late 80s or 90s in the United States. And that was the first time people asked, what's common at different ages? And how do we figure out what's concerning? What's outside of the common range for any given age? And then what about when it's really outside the norm or harmful in some way and you really need to get help? And so we have this idea that as professionals, we've been gaining knowledge about that. And one of my other passions is to bring this information to parents and caregivers, because parents and caregivers freak out when their kids engage in sexual behavior. Often that's their response, or they under respond because people don't have a general knowledge of, say, what 5-year-olds typically do or what 7-year-olds typically do. And then if they're doing something that's outside of that range, they don't really know what to do with that. So often they'll either punish too harshly or not get help when it's needed. But basically, if we all understood what was common, what's concerning, and what's way outside of the range, we could help kiddos get back on track. And that's kind of the idea, is kids with problematic sexual behaviors may be engaging in behaviors that hurt themselves, or could be hurting other kids, but they can get back on track and we can help them. And that's different than teenagers who are over 12, let's say, and are having problems with committing sexual violence, right? Their whole thought process around that is changing. It's more thought out. It's more purposeful than kids who have problematic sexual behaviors. I'm just wondering if anybody has any questions. I think we forgot to say to put them in the chat, and we can answer those as we go.
Okay, so I'm going to share some of these messages that many of us hear or have heard about child sexual abuse. And some of these messages are pretty popular still. So I'm going to read these. Kids should reduce their vulnerability. So you might, when you think about that phrase, kids should reduce their vulnerability, we're thinking about things like telling kids that they shouldn't be certain places or be with certain people or with certain kinds of people or wear certain clothes, those kinds of things, right? Kids should reduce their vulnerability. Lots of messaging around that. The next one, kids should recognize it. So the idea that kids should be responsible for noticing certain things. Maybe we're looking at different messaging around teaching kids how to see certain things, right? You can probably imagine some of those kinds of messages that maybe you've heard. Kids should stop it. So if it's happening, or if it's about to happen, or if there are signs that it's going to happen, that kids, this is where we often tell kids, say no, run away, do something to this person, some of those kinds of messages. Some of you might be familiar to you. And the last one, kids should tell about it. So how many of you, maybe if you know how to use the reaction to raise your hand, or you could just say yes in the chat, either way, how many of you have heard similar messages to that? Or you can also put in the chat, what are some of the messages that you heard about child sexual abuse, maybe growing up, or even in media, there's sometimes messaging, or in school, about child sexual abuse. What are some of the messages you heard? I see Casey saying that connects with some of the messages that she heard. See a thumbs up. Yeah. Yeah. Stranger danger. Yes. Right. The idea that strangers is who does it. So you should stay away from strangers because that's who does child sexual abuse. Yeah. And I know I've shared this story a few times when I was, don't trust anyone, run away. Yeah. Victim blaming and stranger danger. Only bad kids get abused. So don't be bad. Yes. Yeah. And I was reading the chat. So for the interpreters, I hope that's help. I'll say when I read the chat, maybe I should do that. I'll let you all know. So then you can just read it if that's helpful. I know, the one experience I had in school with someone talking about sexual violence, child sexual abuse. Actually, I'm not sure what she was talking about now that I think about it. Oh, kids always lie. That's another message that sometimes is heard. I had a teacher that basically said, if you girls, so there was an idea there about who it happens to, girls, right? You girls, if someone tries something, and of course, as a kid, I had an idea what try something means, right? If someone tries something, then you should put your thumb by their nose and try to scoop their eyeball. That was the instruction. That was my 7th grade health teacher's instruction on child abuse prevention, right? So that messaging there, who is all that holding responsible for preventing or stopping child abuse? The kids, exactly. So when we think about that, what realities are being ignored about child sexual abuse? And you can answer this in the chat. And I'll be reading the chat, so if any interpreter sees the chat, they can go ahead and read that. The perpetrator is being ignored. The power dynamics, who has the power, is being ignored. Exactly. And so those are some of the things that we're going to think more about, those dynamics. Threats and confusion are being ignored. The kids maybe feel confused about what's happening, what type of support everyone needs. Exactly. Nobody is in a bubble alone in this world, and you can give someone instruction. That doesn't mean they have the support to actually do the skills that those instructions are requiring. And there's a metaphor that we often use of a dragon. So we see this dragon here, right? Big dragon, right? This is old school Knights of the Round Table style dragon, right? And we have the knight here, right? We've given him a helmet. He has a sword. He has some gear, and he's going to go fight the dragon. So that's like our little kid. We said there's a person out there. They're scary. You'll recognize them because they are a scary, fire-breathing Knights of the Round Table dragon, and you're going to go out and fight them, right? And we see there's obvious size mismatch. There's some things that could make it very difficult, even in this scenario, for that knight to fight that dragon. However, what we know and what you all addressed in a lot of those dynamics and what we talked about within the statistics about child sexual abuse is this is really more like what we would see as far as that dragon, right? It's a dragon, yes,
Oops.
but it's smiling, right? It's waving. And I might not be sure that that was the dragon that they had to put on the armor for or the sword for, right? There's some things about that scenario that are confusing. And so when we presented this metaphor to teachers and talked about this idea that when we're looking at child sexual abuse, and even a lot of times other kinds of sexual violence, we're thinking about sometimes people that are trusted at first, people who are not scary at first, right? There are things happening that make it confusing or scary to speak up. And once again, we're talking about this little person, this younger person, the person with less power. And so we want to share some things that teachers said that they felt like would make that would be barriers to that technique of prevention, having it be all on the kids. The kids are the ones that need to be empowered to face this. Here's some messages they shared. So I'm going to read a few of them. So this one in the top left corner says a lot of times it's people that they trust or care for, so they don't want them in trouble. Then the next yellow one here says family not believing them. The blue one underneath, I don't want my family member to get arrested. And of course, we even think about the way that it's spoken of, right? Oftentimes, this monster, this horrible person is going to go to jail. That language might not resonate with the kid as far as doing the skill of telling or doing these skills of maybe some kind of aggressive action towards this person. The next green one here, feeling that they are unclean and that it was their fault, right? These are all things that teachers have pointed out, and these are really excellent ones. This next one in the middle, I know many of you will recognize, freezing is a real trauma response, right? What does that do as far as doing these types of skills? And this bottom right green one, kids being afraid to tell, ruining family dynamics, threatened by the abuser. And of course, when we're thinking about that, we're going to look at that phrase because oftentimes child sexual abuse doesn't involve outright threats, but having that understanding that there might be big differences in what that kid thinks their life is supposed to be like, and that might feel a little bit scary and does feel scary. So Sally and I wanted to address the statistics just for a minute. We know that we had some statistics around males and females, and there were not statistics out there that we found that was really good data that was on a large enough scale that seemed to really paint a good picture on non-binary or gender non-conforming people. But we do know that there's some being collected over the past couple of years. There's been some being collected. So we hope that soon we'll be able to use those statistics as well. But what we do know is that marginalization increases vulnerability to violence. And we know that because we know that sexual violence is about power. So when we're looking at people who are BIPOC, right? People that are on the in the LGBTQ plus IAA community or have disabilities, we know that because of much messaging about power, where it's located, who's believed, some of those things, that it's going to be happening more in those communities. And we can recognize it even within the Bring Back Our Girls, the movement around Indigenous and Native women and some of the things that we're seeing within that community. It really does show that oppression, racism are truly at the core of sexual violence and truly a humongous part of the power dynamic that allows it to fester and continue.
So, as I said earlier, we're going to be teasing out some of those differences and some of the similarities between some words that we commonly use to describe sexual violence. And there's no one definition for any of these things. These are just some ways that Denise and I have seen these terms be used. So I'm going to read this. Sexual assault, non-consensual sexual contact, often used when discussing behaviors that occur between adults and adults or teens and teens. It often happens once, often includes some type of violence, manipulation, or some type of incapacitation. Can happen between people that know each other well, intimate partners, people who just met, or strangers. So what we know, all of us collectively here in this group, I would bet on knowing that when sexual violence happens inside of an intimate relationship, it definitely does not happen once. It's going to happen more. Danny's recently found a CDC report, and it's called the National Intimate Partner Violence report or research that looked at that and found that about 45.1% of sexual assault is inside of an intimate relationship. So that is an exception to the way this is describing sexual assault, which also means that about 54.9% is happening outside, which probably would fit more of this definition. And by the way, if anybody wants some of the resources that we are talking about, the research we're quoting, definitely reach out to me and email me and I'll send you those. We may put some of the links into the chat as well sometimes for this. So just in common ways that this is talked about, this is how we've seen sexual assault being described. We're going to look at sexual harassment and child sexual abuse too. Sexual harassment, a pattern of unwanted sexual behavior towards someone. Often it includes sexual talk, may include sexual actions, sexual touching or gestures. Often the people are similar in age, adults to adults or teens to teens. Often describes behaviors that happen in workplaces or schools. Rarely includes violence, but may include threats or implied rewards. The person doing the harassing has higher status than the one being harassed. So this term, sexual harassment, is often used for things that are happening in the workplace. Often that person that is doing the harassing is of higher status or a boss. In school situations, usually that's happening by someone who has a higher status, but may or may not. And schools have policies and procedures around it. And a lot of times sexual harassment is handled inside the place that it's happening, meaning like sexual harassment in school, there's policies around that. Schools would be working with that. And then inside a workplace, it doesn't always go to the legal realm. Sometimes it does.
And one thing that we always like to point out is the reason that we emphasize similar ages with sexual harassment is that if there was a child and an adult, or someone under 18 and an adult, it would fit this next category better, which is child sexual abuse.
Child sexual abuse, sexual contact between people, and at least one of them is under 18. Almost always happens more than once and gets worse over time. Rarely includes violence and rarely includes threats. Often includes giving the younger person special things or more attention than others. Doesn't always include sexual touching. One person has more power than the other. Consent is not possible. So what we're getting at here is definitely someone under 18 and that gradual progression of sexual contact. It is often, and most of the time actually, a gradual progression. And it's done in such a way that it's often very, very confusing to the youth who's experiencing it. So we've separated them out, and yet reality is they look more like this, right? They have some overlaps, some ways that people might be using those terms. And maybe one person would say, no, I actually think that's not sexual assault. I think that's child sex abuse. And so one of the things we think about when we think about that is first looking at, and this is where I'd love for you to put some stuff in the chat, what's in the middle? What connects all of those? So please feel free to put some stuff in the chat around that. Denise or somebody else, if you want to read what's in the chat, that'd be great.
I know there's a tiny lag from when people are typing to when we can see it. So give it
Okay.
a minute. Trauma, that's a great one. Yes.
Yeah.
That definitely connects all three. Power over.
Power
Yes.
over. Yes.
Lack of boundaries. Unwanted by one of the parties.
Yep. These are great.
Lack of consent.
Yep. It's true.
Intentionality. Definitely. That's a really
Yes.
important one.
It is. The person who's doing the harm is intentionally harming.
And the person who's doing the harm knows that they're intentionally harming. Image crafting, another good one. Yes.
Ooh, yeah. When I hear that, I think the person who's doing the harming, how they present themselves to the world. And when I hear that, I also think of with child sexual abuse, how they're presenting themselves, and maybe this fits for all of them, to the child, and how they're taking advantage of how the child not only sees them, but the whole relationship. And I think about this 16-year-old I met who had 2 kids, and by the same person, and she started going out with him, as she described it, when she was 13. And at 16, she was starting to have a very different view of what that relationship was when she was 13 than she certainly did when she was 13. And I have friends, and I bet you all do too, who have experienced sexual violence in particularly their young adolescents, and maybe even a little bit older adolescents. And the way that they see it over time changes. So image crafting around not only the person who doing the harm purposefully in doing that, but also how we ourselves make sense of it and make meaning of it as we are traveling through life, as we are growing and developing an understanding of the world and relationships.
Yes. And I want to add to that, we're going to look at an example of that image crafting, and how it also includes sometimes the perpetrator crafting an image for the person that's being harmed, and putting an image on that person that they take on because of the circumstance.
So you may have noticed every time that somebody comes or goes, I play around and you'll see a black box, but it'll go away. Anything else in the chat?
No, that's good.
Okay. So when we do this, Denise, I'm going to hand this over to you to talk about the quiz, because when we do it in person, we do it a certain way, but you have the chance to interact with us in a different way today.
So we've put together a little, I don't want to say quiz, I guess a little survey.
That's true.
And what you're going to do with the survey, I'm going to put it in the chat, and you're going to be looking at some facts and deciding of these facts which are true for just one of these, maybe just sexual assault, which are true for child sexual abuse or sexual harassment, or is it true for all three or just two? And so you can go ahead and click on that and start doing that, and we'll look at the answers together. One thing I want to remind everyone is that the definition of sexual assault we're using is not one that includes what we would maybe term like a family or relationship sexual assault. We're looking at that other 54% that are not within a long-term relationship. So when you're looking at those stats, I think it says it in there, but just to kind of clarify how that's going to be looked at. And we, as soon as responses come in, we can look at them together and talk about them. So go ahead and
Yeah. I
jump
encourage
on that.
everybody to kind of pick your first thought on that.
Yeah. And you will have the ability to click to check mark as many boxes. You can check mark all three on as many of them as you'd like. None of them will restrict you in how you select your choices. Oh, we should have had a interpreted version.
I apologize for that.
I will.
Yes, it's definitely a survey because we're not having grades. There isn't necessarily one perfect right answer either.
I will share the screen. Make it big as they come in. Scroll down out of my pure curiosity before we talk about it.
There's a lot on here.
Yeah.
I forgot how many questions we had put. Okay.
Okay, well, we can start with this first one. This form of sexual violence happens within a romantic relationship. And I see that a lot of people chose, I think a lot of people chose both sexual harassment and sexual assault, which is interesting to me. And I think that the one that we were thinking of was mostly sexual assault because of the type of contact and how that, you know, how that can happen within some kind of a dating context or some of those kinds of things. Sally, did you have anything you want to add?
Just that I'm guessing that, and I agree with the people that chose child sex abuse when they were probably thinking of teenagers having us being engaged sexually by someone who was in their 20s or something like that. And I think there's a great discussion around all those things. I do think a lot of the times that as people age and grow, they do look back on that relationship and see that differently than they did, particularly if they're younger teenagers. And I can see why people would say that about particularly teenagers. And I think the end of our talk today will be interesting for that issue.
Yes, it's very interesting, especially when we speak to kids in schools, how they see themselves as the younger person, as being mature and able to engage in different kinds of relationships versus how they see themselves as an older person. If you ask them, well, as a 14-year-old, would you want to date a 10-year-old? They have a little different idea about that. So we're going to be thinking about those power dynamics more. This form of sexual violence happens between people of similar ages. And I'm guessing that the folks who chose child sexual abuse are thinking of folks who maybe are 16 and have a abusing problem with much younger kids, and the idea that they are all under 18. But of course, that large age difference would be what distinguishes that as child sexual abuse.
Or they might be thinking of like a freshman in high school dating a senior in high school when they're giving some of the other answers.
True, very true. Only happens once unless it's part of a long-term relationship. We see the majority chose sexual assault. And it's true that most of the time child sexual abuse is not going to happen once. Extremely, extremely rarely would it happen only once because of some of the things Sally brought out around the manipulation and things like that that have to occur most of the time for child sexual abuse. And of course, sexual harassment is a pattern. So generally it's going to be something that happens more than once for that pattern to be established. This form of sexual violence usually doesn't involve physical violence. Both show sexual harassment and a few chose child sexual abuse. And we would have probably chosen both child sexual abuse and sexual harassment. A lot of people think that there is some kind of physical intimidation when really it's a lot more of the things that you all mentioned that are in the middle, a lot more of the manipulation, image crafting. I really love that phrase, by the way. Some of those other types of manipulation more than physical violence. Sally, did you want to add anything?
No, I think I'll add some more when we talk about relationship boundaries, maybe.
And this form of sexual violence always gets worse over time. The key word being always, which is why we would choose sexual harassment or child sexual abuse. Of course, once again, if we were thinking of a long-term committed relationship, sexual assault in that type of relationship would get worse over time. But as far as always getting worse over time, like we know, sometimes it does happen once when we're thinking of we're thinking of sexual assault, not child sexual abuse. I think I talked too fast there. This form of violence, sexual violence, happens between people of similar ages. Let me have had that one twice. Sorry about that. With this form of sexual violence, blaming is used so that the secret is kept. And I like that there's a bit of a spread here, but many people chose all three. And I think we would choose all three because sometimes, even if blaming isn't used outright, we know that discussion of within sexual harassment, well, that person was wearing this, what did they expect? Or some of those things that are kind of just ingrained in our culture can definitely create that environment of blaming, right? So within all three, the idea that the person who was harmed is complicit, and that is something that encourages the secret to be kept. Maybe it's not outright, but oftentimes there's some implied blaming that leads to the secret being kept. Sally, do you want to take this one?
Sexual violence and threats. So interesting. There's a bunch of different layouts here. My guess is people chose more than one as well when they were thinking of these. What I want to say about child sex abuse, particularly when there's an adult person who's doing the harming, as opposed to a teenage person who's doing the harming. Violence isn't part of it a lot of the time, or threats. A lot of it's more just like things like, your mom doesn't want to have sex with me anymore, or I'm gonna teach you how to be a good wife when you grow up, or if you let me do this, I won't do it to your brother. You're the son I never had. You remind me of your grandma when she was your age. These are literally ones I've heard said, and that is so much more common than a blatant threat. People who sexually abuse kids do sometimes threaten as well. more things, but more often it's really implied, and the threat might be no one will believe you, would be a much more common threat than anything else in terms of child sex abuse.
And then this one, with this form of violence, one person is under 18. The majority chose child sexual abuse. Yes. All right. Really nice,
Thank you
everyone.
all for doing that.
Thanks for your participation.
Yeah. Clean up my screen here for a second. All right. So one other thing, I found this recently from the National Sexual Violence Resource Center. And when I think about stats, what I think about is how does it now, and how will it in the future inform the way that I talk about sexual violence, and inform the way that I talk with youth about it, inform the way that I talk with adults about it. So I hope looking at this makes you start thinking about this. And I want to say a few things about this slide. It's of course along the gender binary, which a lot of research is, and hopefully that will start changing more. So the way that I'm phrasing the stats, the statistics on the slide are along the gender binary because the research is on the gender binary. So 27.7% of girls by a family member. When I see that, the first thing I think of is mostly that's probably what we would call child sex abuse or incest. Maybe it's two cousins that are maybe similar ages, and that might be on the outside look a lot more like teen sexual assault. However, because it's a family member, those dynamics are going to be different. All those things that the teacher said, that Jamboard with the sticky notes, all those are going to exist. And that's almost a third. So think about that. How can we use that information when we're talking to youth, when we're talking to teenagers about sexual violence, and make sure that we include that as part of the reality that we know exists? And then the first two numbers, 10% girls victimized by a stranger, 43.6% girls by an acquaintance. So almost 54%, it is not in the context of any kind of romantic, intimate relationship. Are we including those messages when we're talking about teen sexual assault? I know I haven't been enough. So this is going to help me do better. And I hope it helps you. Then, of course, the 28.8% of girls by a partner or a former partner. I think we do a great job of acknowledging that reality when we're talking about teen sexual assault. Most of us, that's the frame that we're coming from. I find the last statistic really interesting. 35% of boys were made to victimize someone else by an acquaintance. So I'm thinking of those parties, right? Where teen sexual assault happens. And I want to get better when I'm talking about this with teens to acknowledge that reality and to help particularly humans who identify as boys think about that, what that's really about, because what we're getting at, I think, is some of those cultural norms about gender, right? And that if you do not stand up to someone who is encouraging you to do violence, that you'll be seen as weak.
So we're going to look at these questions next when thinking about child sexual abuse, some of these dynamics. How do people relate to kids when they have an intent to sexually abuse them? How does the nature of the relationship and the type of manipulation affect the child? And how do kids perceive the sexual abuse? And then finally, why do people sexually abuse children? So before we go right into that, we want to look at this question. What's consent got to do with it, right? Is consent possible when child sexual abuse happens? And if you have thoughts about that, you can put that in the chat. We generally, when we're thinking about some of the things we're going to be going into around a child's brain, or even a teen or an adolescent's brain, we would say no, because of some of the things that they may not comprehend or understand about the power dynamics in the relationship and the amount of choice that they have. Yes, Ashley says, no, children cannot consent. Exactly. And just because someone that's older has crafted an image of this young person that makes them feel like they are or can, that doesn't mean that they can or that they are. And we also know that many times, I've experienced this talking to adults that have dealt with child sexual abuse as an older teen, that there's a lot of self-protection there of not wanting to really think about what was happening within that first relationship that they had with someone who was much older. And so it's a complicated topic, but we would say that this is true, that there's no way that permission or that consent can happen within those types of relationships or contexts.
That's just another question to think about. Would your answer change? Would your thoughts about this change? And why or why not? What's that about? And again, looking at that developmental trajectory, how are humans understanding relationships and sexuality at different ages? And how does that affect their ability to truly, truly give informed consent?
So one of the things Sally mentioned earlier, she was really giving some examples of emotional boundaries. And so when we're talking about boundaries, we know that a lot of times we think about personal boundaries, the idea of what someone personally has the right to or feels is right or makes sense for them. What we're talking about right now is relationship boundaries. I want to pause for a minute and read this comment in the chat because it's important. It says, "We are wired for connection, and many children are victimized by family members. Between the biological predisposition for connection and attachment and the law of reciprocity, when people do nice things for us and then ask for something in return, want very much to please and make their caregivers happy. They cannot consent to their own victimization, and they are not responsible for how other people take advantage of their vulnerability." And that is so excellent. And I would add to the idea of caregivers to other adults in their lives who perhaps are extending things to them, to people who identify themselves as romantic partners in some way, but are much older, that many of these same things are true. Ashley, thank you so much for that. And this ties really, really well, especially to the idea of emotional relationship boundary norms. So when we think about relationship boundary norms, we're thinking about the expectations for how people relate to each other. And what we mean by people are different categories of people. So like, for example, we always say that, or I always say, Sally might too, that the first time you learn about relationship boundaries is birth. Because when you're born, you come out, right? Your sense of smell is telling you that there is a person nearby that's going to provide you with physical affection, with nourishment, right? You have an expectation about touch, about emotional care, right? And some of these things are things that we will be learning from birth, very, very early on, what that attachment or trust looks like, right? We also might think about other roles that we learn about later in life. Maybe we have an idea about teachers and physical boundaries. We go to kindergarten, we might have an idea about how teachers are going to enter our space, how teachers are going to touch us, right? Versus how our grandmother is going to touch us. We might think there's not a lot of commonalities between some of the ways that maybe my grandmother might sit for a really long time with their arm on my shoulder, right? But my teacher is not going to do that, not for a really long time, right? Behavioral boundaries, some of those ideas of rules, right? What kids are supposed to do, what adults are supposed to do, what do I expect out of behavior, right? Some of those boundary norms, relationship boundary norms. And then emotional, how close you feel. This idea that, like Ashley said, right, that there's this, it's okay that if my mom says, I love you, I say I love you to her, right? I show affection in a way that is between mom and child, right? And that there's some things that maybe when I'm talking to my mom, I talk about it differently to my best friend. Like maybe I was, on a date, probably would talk about that differently, especially if I was 12, with my mom than my friend or a crush, right? The kind of gifts given, the time you spend together. So this is what a lot of the stuff Sally was getting at when she was talking about some of the things that would be said that would manipulate these boundaries. And Sally, I'm sure you want to expand on that a little bit more.
I'm thinking just a lot of us together here today have ideas about norms. So again, we pattern our behavior based on our learning throughout our lives and what we expect and what we see. So this is, like Danny said, it's very different than for me personally. I'm a hugger or I'm not a hugger. These are the general cultural norms around these things, right? And they're different for different cultures, and yet there's some similarities. And there's also differences amongst families. And for the emotional boundaries particularly, no matter what kind of violence is happening, emotional boundaries are being messed with. You could all think about how in domestic violence, these kind of things are manipulated. And a lot of that is about controlling and manipulating how the person experiencing the violence sees the relationship, how they're experiencing the context of the violence and why it's happening and making meaning of it. And the part about what you talk about and what you don't talk about, particularly with child sexual abuse, most of the time when people have an intent to sexually abuse a kid, they start gradually manipulating all of these boundaries, particularly what you talk about with sexual talk and those kind of things. But for kids who are experiencing manipulation by someone who is wanting to sexually abuse them, they are a lot like the frog in the water, that experiment where gradually all these boundaries are being manipulated and they don't really recognize the danger. It's very confusing. And the person who's wanting to do the harm is really specifically trying to keep that person in a state of either confusion, guilt, or shame or fear around what's happening. Or you can think about like a 27-year-old going out with a 16-year-old. That 16-year-old is definitely probably perceiving that as a romantic relationship. And there may be a lot of elements to it, or some elements that are really like any other romantic relationship. And there may be some that have a lot of differences with power and manipulating how they see that. So keep that in mind as we keep going through today.
And a lot of that connects to where those behavioral boundaries come back in. So when we think about that manipulation, we're thinking about things like maybe showing a kid pornography. So if a kid thinks, well, if I speak up about that, about what's happening, well, I also broke this rule, right? Or perhaps alcohol use, when we're thinking about some of these, or even maybe the family has beliefs about dating. So if a person even should be dating, right? And you've broken that rule. Now you're in this relationship. And so it can make a kid feel responsible and feel that guilt, shame, blame, even if it's not stated.
Mm-hmm. Right. Asking you to keep secrets, maybe about where you go or what you do or how much time you spend with each other. Secrets around that too.
So Sally, how are you feeling about the quiz?
I'm feeling like we don't have time for that.
I agree. Okay. So one of the things that we think about with the idea about child sexual abuse particularly is that for a young person, particularly older young person, right, they're going to exist different places on this spectrum at different times, right? So we can do the first one. So this is my son, Azariah. He's 13. And there are situations that he has less power, right? He has less power with adults in his life, oftentimes, most of the time. As a kid, of course, he would have less power in that way. When we think about the larger scheme of things, right? Like oppression and things like that. He has, as far as maybe riding a bike freely in our neighborhood, isn't something we're always comfortable with as a family, because some of the ways that he would be perceived as having less power make our family feel a little concerned for his safety, right? Let me see, there's a comment in the chat, and I want to get to it before I move on. I want to make a short caveat about norms that change with working with minority populations. I tell my clients, who almost everyone with trauma at one point question how they belong or fit in, that our norms were decided between a culture of religion and moral wars. This is a really long comment. So one thing I want to say about this is it's important that relationship boundaries are discussed. Because, oh, sorry, I'm talking too fast. Because of the fact that they are often different between cultures. So like one example that I read about was that there was a video taken of friends in about 4 different countries. So I think it was England, the United States, Puerto Rico, and France, I believe. And they counted how many times they touched each other within a conversation. And they found there were giant differences. Whereas I believe it was in England, they barely touched each other. So in England, relationship boundary, friendship, and of course there's many cultures in England, but the particular, I think it was a dominant culture there at that time that they saw, touching wasn't a big thing. However, when they videoed the Puerto Rican friends, they were touching each other so much. It was definitely within the boundaries of the relationship. So it's important to talk about relationship boundaries and to talk about some of these things explicitly. If there's, especially within work environments or when working with kids, what kids might feel comfortable with and be part of their context of relationship boundaries, to ask questions. Hey, is this something that's normally done within your family or your culture? And to not really feel like those things have to be hidden, but it's good to talk about those things. So back to the idea about power. So there are situations where my son has the same power. So he has friends that are his age that definitely same power dynamic. They're sometimes they're different racially. Sometimes they have certain abilities that can be different, that where it can kind of tip things a little bit more, where he might have a little bit more power as somebody who's able-bodied, not a bunch of allergies, not a bunch of, he does wear glasses, but his glasses work very well. So generally speaking, in those contexts, he has the same power. And same kid, right? There's times that he has more power. As much as his little brother doesn't want to admit it, he definitely has more power than his little brother. I've seen situations where he can influence his little brother's entire train of thought just because he's older, just because his passions are so huge, right? And when he likes being with kids of different ages. And because of that, right, he's in situations where he can try to inspire them or uplift them. And that's how he can use his power for the good. However, we know that with power comes responsibility. There's situations where he has maybe a friend, he does have a friend that has really severe panic attacks, right? Or he has another friend with fetal alcohol syndrome. So there's situations that he does have more power, even within his friend circle, and even within larger circles. And so it's important that when we're talking to kids and to young people and thinking about the ideas about whether it's teen sexual assault or child sexual abuse, that the same kid that has so much power, we homeschool, but if he was in school, I bet he'd be, he loves basketball. He might be that guy out there with, I don't know, popularity and whatever. And there are situations where he has less power, that same exact person, and that they could be at the end of something harmful, or they could be the actor, right? So remembering that when we're thinking about those dynamics.
So a little bit on how children, youth of different ages try and make sense of sexual abuse. Again, that developmental perspective, right? So psychologists study development, right? They study how humans develop. And these authors of this book, Just Before Dawn, took some of those concepts and applied them to how does your age affect how you perceive sexual violence is happening to you. I'm going to say a little bit about that. So 0 to 6, the unaware kid. They often don't even understand what's going on. There's this movie called Close to Home, and I just love it. It's old, but I love this one part when I'm thinking about this. So for the most part, it interviews adults who experience child sex abuse. There's a woman in her 20s that talks about being sexually abused from the time she was 3 to 13 by her stepfather. She says, I didn't even know it was wrong. I mean, I thought it was happening in every family. It's like peanut butter and jelly. You don't even talk about it. That's the unaware child. 7 to 11, developmentally in general. Those kiddos, human beings at that age are often really, really focused on fairness. Things should be fair. Equal portions of food. That's not okay that you treated them nicer. You spent more time with them. They're very focused on that. So when child sex abuse happens to them, they start understanding the significance of it a little bit. They start understanding that what's happening isn't okay. And then the adolescent. So adolescents, of course, are trying to figure out who they are in so many different ways. They're also really learning about themselves as sexual beings. So when sexual violence happens to them, a lot of the times they know, they get it. It's, it should have happened. It's wrong. It's, they may be confused about why it happened or how their body responded. But a lot of times what they want is just to be like everybody else. So like Denise was saying, some of those protective ways that you think about what happened, and 13 Reasons Why, I know that's kind of an older show now, but that did such a great job of showing that, how the adolescents will, in an own way to defend against how others might perceive violence, or how to help themselves, will kind of minimize it, deny it, or try and feel like they had some agency in it. So really quickly, I worked with a family of 3 sisters, a mom and a dad. Unusually so, the dad confessed to sexually abusing all 3 of them. And the youngest girl was 4. So dad was convicted, and her experience of him being gone was just lost. She missed her dad. She just missed him so much. She didn't really get why he had to get away. What was the real problem? Her 9-year-old sister was pretty angry at dad. He shouldn't have done it. Really missed him as well. Really would have wanted him back, just as long as he didn't sexually abuse them anymore. The adolescent was really angry at dad, was angry at all the disruption in the family that happened, and didn't want to deal with it. She just wanted to move on with her life and be a normal, quote, normal kid. Hopefully that'll help you think about kids of different ages and how they think about child sex abuse. Of course, the adults. So I'm not going to talk about that today. That's not where our topic is for today. So another way to think is there's lots of research around the teenage brain. So another way to think about how do youth perceive sexual violence is to think about this, and how just their brain development affects not only how they think about the sexual violence, but what could the person who wants to do harm be taking advantage of? You have some ideas in the chat. We've got, for adolescents and our brains as human beings, we don't do planning and reasoning very well. We're continuing to do that until we're 25. We got a lot more impulsivity and aggression and passion until we're fully matured brains, right? So how might someone who wants to do harm to an adolescent be taking advantage of these things? And I don't know if we'll do much with the chat, Denise, because I do want to get to the rest of this.
We can move on, and if something shows up in the chat, I'll read it.
Oopsie, I didn't need to do that. I'm going back.
Okay.
Okay.
So if you are familiar with who this young person is, can you raise your hand on your virtual hand? Or in the chat, you can say, I do, or say the person's name. In about 5 years, nobody will probably know who this is.
It's true. Well, the documentary came out fairly recently, though.
True, very true. So this is Aaliyah Houghton. She was a very, very well-known singer. And in this picture, she was 14 years old. And the person who produced her album was her abuser, engaged in child sexual abuse. Her album at age 14 was called Age Ain't Nothing But a Number. And these were some of the lyrics to the song. And I'm going to pause for a minute for you all to read them. So when we look at this, this ties together a lot of what we've seen about child sexual abuse, particularly when it comes to adolescence, right? These lyrics were written by her abuser for her to sing. These lyrics paint her as the actor, right? And we can see that even for this person, she died at a fairly young age, but she was an adult when she died. And even at that time, she hadn't really spoken about the abuse. And some things like this song give us clues as to why folks that heard the songs, that saw her out with this adult man and had probably a pretty good idea that sexual things were happening, that no one at that time recognized it, that this was child sexual abuse happening, and that she even herself never was able to really confront that, at least in a public way, among the people that were fans of her music that listened to it. And so this is something that when we think about the idea of a romantic relationship, right, with an adult and a teenager, or the question of how much agency that a young person has that's being manipulated so much, right? And the power that we want them to be able to get some of that power back and be able to engage with some of the things and get support and to recover and heal from those things, which Aaliyah hopefully did. She was in a pretty positive relationship that seemed positive at the time she died. But this last thing that we want to share from this slide, that we say to young people that's in our curriculum, a child can't agree to sexual activity. Consent is not present. And most importantly, the older person knows they are breaking the rules. The younger person is not able to consent. The one who knows the rules, the one who's manipulating the situation, the one who's responsible for these ideas about boundaries and image crafting and all of those things, is the one that we have always as society held responsible for that, which is the adults. So when we think about this question, we're just going to share some things around why people sexually abuse children, that there is no simple reason for why someone misuses children. We know that if they have a position of power or influence and they choose to be sexual with the child, that there are different reasons that might be. Some thoughts and some things that some research shows is that there's a person with power or influence over a child, with proximity to that child, oftentimes, or proximity to children in general, that develops a sexual interest in the child. And that for that person, the internal and external barriers or stops that would normally prevent them from betraying that child's trust are overcome. And oftentimes there's also, that comes along with those manipulations we talked about, to the extent that they feel like they can get away with that, because they feel like those boundaries have been manipulated to that extent, and that person acts on those fantasies and impulses toward the child, and that's generally much of how and why people choose to do that.
So a little bit about mandatory reporting, really little bit. I think in general, what I think about is that whenever I hear about training with mandatory reporting, mostly what I hear about is how to recognize that you're in a mandatory reporting situation and how to do it. There's very little about doing it in a trauma-informed way. So we're going to speak just a little about that.
So when we think about mandatory reporting and confidential advocacy, one thing that we really want to point out is there are some things that are very similar about the goals, especially when it's trauma-informed. And we know that a big part of it being trauma-informed means that the kid understands that they're speaking to a mandatory reporter, that they have chosen to speak to someone who is then going to take this information elsewhere. And that we encourage teachers to not just teachers, mandatory reporters in general, but not only to say upfront within a context of connection, perhaps class rules or whatever that might be, that I'm a mandatory reporter, this is what it means. If you have questions about it, I'm here for you. Here's a good way to ask questions without disclosing anything. And yet, again, if a kid comes and says, I want to have a personal conversation or something's happening in my life, we encourage them to say it again. I personally, I feel like saying it over and over to the extent that a kid has literally come up to me and said, so I want to talk to you, but I know you're a mandatory reporter. And if I tell you blah, blah, right, and they can literally repeat it back to you because they have that awareness, right? And we know that many of the schools are offering confidential advocacy, but that idea of informed consent within both mandatory reporting and confidential advocacy is something that's in common. That if it's trauma-informed, that idea of informed consent exists within both ideas. And also a knowledge that within both mandatory reporting and confidential advocacy, the goal is for the person to receive support to heal. Not necessarily that the goal is that we're going to arrest all the people that were engaged in sexual violence. We all know that that's obviously not, or majority of the time, not what happens, right? The goal is to support the young person that has come forward about whatever's happening in their life.
Denise, do you have the links to the two resources ready to roll so you can put them in the chat? Okay, so two resources to highlight around trauma-informed responding, which is different than trauma-informed reporting. We're going to offer you two. One is from the Oregon Department of Education, and the other one is from our own curriculum, what we put in there when we're trying to help school staff navigate mandatory reporting. So hopefully those will be helpful to you, just in terms of thinking about maybe if you are a mandatory reporter, how to describe it, but also if you're an advocate, how you might be talking about the differences between mandatory reporting and confidential advocacy. You might be presenting about that kind of stuff, and to think about, hopefully this will offer you ideas for doing it, and they could be helpful.
I know we don't have a ton of time. We had a video, in fact, maybe we should still link the video that gives you a little tour of CARES, because one of the things we do want folks to kind of have an idea about is what responding to child sexual abuse looks like sometimes within a place like CARES. And so I'm going to drop that link in the chat in a minute.
Okay.
But another thing I wanted to just kind of connect to that is within CARES, there are folks who are interviewers, and they're forensic interviewers. And so what that means is that they've been trained on how to receive that young person's story. And so because of that, because we have that resource, when kids are making mandatory reports or they're coming to CARES, we do hope that they haven't been asked too many questions about the details of any violence that might have happened to them, especially outside of what they might say, like if you asked a question like, is there anything else you'd like to tell me? And they share whatever they'd like to share, and hopefully that feels helpful to them. Some of those more specific questions are going to be asked in a very trauma-informed way with a ton of support at a place like CARES.
And I see someone has their hand up.
I
So
think that was from earlier when
that
we,
was from earlier. Okay. All right. So thank you all for being here today. I did put my contact information in the chat. I'm kind of the communication hub for our prevention department here. So reach out to me if you have any questions or thoughts, comments, feedback, whatever. I'm here and open to all of that. But thanks so much for having us.
Thanks everyone for being here.
Thank you very much to both of you. And we will close for now, but if you have any questions, please feel free to email myself or Denise or Sally, and we can follow up with you. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Okay, bye everybody.